Now let's talk about Sheriff Jake Carter, who was relishing a rare weekend of peace. His home, nestled on the outskirts of the neighborhood, was conveniently just outside the HOA's jurisdiction, exactly how he preferred it. As he sipped his still steaming coffee, the sound of screeching tires interrupted his moment. A moment later, his neighbor Tom barreled up the porch, his face flushed with anger. "They've lost their damn minds, Jake!" Tom, panting, gestured wildly down the road. "The HOA put down spike strips." Jake blinked in confusion. "Come. Again?" Tom threw up his hands in exasperation. "Spike strips! On our road!" "They say it's to prevent reckless driving," he continued. Jake couldn't grasp how that made sense. Their road wasn't private. It was maintained by the county. Surely this had to be a misunderstanding. "I'll check it out," Heitz said, grabbing his keys. As he drove toward the neighborhood entrance, he spotted them right away, shiny metal spikes embedded in the pavement and controlled by some sort of remote device. Standing next to them was a smug-looking man in an HOA security uniform, arms crossed. Jake rolled down his window. "Morning, what's going on here?" "New HOA safety measure," the guard Greg replied with an arrogant grin. "Stops non-members from speeding through." Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "This is a county road, not HOA property." Greg shrugged nonchalantly. "Our board says otherwise. Got a problem? Take it up with them." Before Jake could respond, a sedan turned into the neighborhood, the driver obliviously heading straight for the spikes. A sharp crack shattered the morning calm, followed by the sound of startled yelling. The car lurched to a stop, its two front tires blown. Jake exhaled slowly, realizing this wasn't just an overreach. It was a situation destined for a lawsuit, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The middle-aged driver climbed out, disbelief etched on his face as he stared at the wrecked tires. "You have got to be kidding me!" he shouted, pointing at the spikes. "What the hell is this?" Greg, the HOA enforcer, hardly acknowledged him. "You should have read the new HOA rules. Any non-approved vehicles must stop for inspection." "Inspection," the man exclaimed, clearly livid. "I live here." Greg brandished a clipboard, looking every bit like a Border Patrol agent. "Then you should have registered your vehicle with the HOA. No sticker means no entry without clearance." Jake leaned against his truck, amused by the absurdity unfolding before him. He could see Greg enjoying the little authority he wielded. The unfortunate driver, on the other hand, was visibly red with anger. Jake decided it was time to step in. "You do realize that obstructing vehicles like this is illegal, right?" Greg's smirk was infuriating. "It's not illegal. The HOA board approved it." Jake shook his head, suppressing a chuckle. "You really think the HOA board can override county law?" Greg folded his arms, unimpressed. "Unless you're part of the HOA, your opinion doesn't matter." If only this guy knew who he was dealing with. Jake stifled a laugh. Instead, he redirected his attention to the spikes. "How do you control these?" Greg tapped his pocket. "Remote access. Only HOA security can disable them." "Keeps the riffraff out," he sneered. The man off to the side, with his tires ruined, stepped forward. "You just cost me $2,000 in damage." "File a complaint with the board," Greg replied, without a hint of remorse. Jake had seen enough. These folks weren't just overstepping boundaries. They were on a full-fledged power trip. He smirked slightly. "All right, I'll take it up with the board." Greg nodded condescendingly. "Smart choice." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, really smart." They had no clue they were about to provoke the actual sheriff. Jake's annoyance had morphed into curiosity. HOA overreach was common, but spike strips? That was something else entirely. He crouched down, inspecting the mechanism. These spikes weren't the cheap pop-up kind. They operated on a motorized system, retracting only when Greg pressed a remote. That meant they could ensnare anyone at will. A woman's voice broke through his thoughts. "Sheriff Carter, isn't it?" Jake looked up to see Nancy Wilkins, the HOA president, approaching, with her characteristic forced smile. She exuded the slick confidence of someone who was accustomed to getting her way. "You must understand," she started, clasping her hands together. "This is about safety. We had an incident last month. Someone drove 10 miles over the speed limit. We can't have chaos." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And this safety measure is only for those without HOA stickers?" Nancy maintained her smile, unfazed. "We control access. HOA members follow the rules. Outsiders? Not so much." Jake shot a glance at the frustrated driver, still grumbling about his shredded tires. "So, if I skip out on HOA dues, I'm suddenly an outsider? Even though I live right next door?" Nancy cocked her head to the side. "Technically, yes." Jake chuckled. "Right. Well, I'll be digging into this." As Jake turned to leave, something caught his eye, an inconspicuous camera tucked high on a street lamp. If the HOA was recording, they had evidence of every illegal stop. That could be incredibly useful. He decided to keep his plans to himself, let them believe they'd come out on top, at least for now. Back at his office, Jake sank into his chair, fingers drumming rhythmically on his desk. His instincts nudged him. This wasn't merely an HOA flexing its muscles. They were surely capitalizing on this scheme. He pulled up the county property records. Just as he suspected, the road wasn't controlled by the HOA. It was maintained by the county. That meant Greg and his crew had no legitimate right to block it or damage vehicles. Jake dove deeper, hunting for any complaints lodged against the HOA. The findings were worse than he had thought. Numerous residents had voiced grievances about exorbitant fines, threats of foreclosure over minor lawn issues, and attempts to tow cars parked illegally. The spike strips were merely the latest in a lengthy history of HOA extortion. "Bingo," Jake muttered as he reached for his phone. First, he dialed the county commissioner's office. "Hey, Doug, I need to confirm that Maple Ridge Road is public property." Doug let out a chuckle. "You mean the road the HOA's been trying to claim for years?" "Yep, it's not theirs. Why's that?" Jake couldn't help but grin. "Because they just installed spike strips and are charging fees for access." Doug whistled sharply. "That's felony territory." Next, Jake called his deputies. "Meet me at Maple Ridge tomorrow morning. We're putting a stop to this." He ended the call, leaning back in satisfaction. Yet a lingering thought gnawed at him. The HOA had to know they didn't own the road, which meant they either believed they could get away with it or had larger plans in motion. Either way, they were about to discover just how mistaken they were. Jake wasn't going to simply inform the HOA they were breaking the law. He wanted to conclusively prove it. That night, he parked his truck a few blocks away and retraced his steps to the spike strips, a small hidden camera in tow. He had seen the arrangement in daylight, but now, under the cloak of night, he aimed to uncover who was truly orchestrating this operation. He positioned the camera discreetly, high on a street lamp and perfectly angled to capture the spikes. He then waited patiently. As expected, shortly after midnight, a golf cart approached, its small headlights flickering against the asphalt. Greg, the enforcer for the Homeowners Association, exited the vehicle, surveying his surroundings as if he were in a tense espionage film. From his concealed position, Jake observed as Greg retrieved a remote control, pressed a button, and the spikes retracted with a click. However, rather than leaving them retracted, he manually reset them, ensuring they would ensnare unsuspecting drivers once more in the morning. Yet, Greg's actions did not end there. He produced a clipboard and began to sift through a list of license plate numbers. Jake focused intently, realizing they were targeting specific individuals. Vehicles belonging to HOA members? Spikes down. Vehicles of non-members? Spikes up. Greg chuckled to himself before re-entering the golf cart and vanishing down the street. A smirk crossed Jake's face. He had them. By morning, he would possess all the evidence he required. Evidence of intent, evidence of selective targeting, and evidence that this was not a matter of safety. It was about financial gain and control. By the time the Homeowners Association awoke, the law would be poised to confront them. At dawn, Jake arrived at Maple Ridge Road But this time, he was not alone. 3 police cars trailed behind him, their red and blue lights flashing. Deputies emerged, hands resting on their belts. Greg, still groggy in his golf cart, nearly sputtered his coffee upon seeing the scene unfold. "Oh, what is happening?" he stuttered. Jake advanced, brandishing his badge. "Sheriff Jake Carter here. You are under investigation for illegal road obstruction, willful property damage, and extortion." Nancy Wilkins, the president of the HOA, hurried out of her residence, visibly distressed. "This is a misunderstanding. We were merely enforcing neighborhood regulations." Jake retrieved his tablet and pressed play. The footage from the hidden camera revealed Greg sneaking out at night, resetting the spike strips and deliberately targeting non-members. Nancy's complexion drained. "You were aware this road did not belong to you," Jake stated. "Now you face felony charges for tampering with a public roadway." Greg opened his mouth to protest, just as one of Jake's deputies placed handcuffs on him. The HOA members stood in shock, witnessing their so-called enforcers being taken away. Jake turned to Nancy. "Do you still wish to discuss misunderstandings?" She remained silent. A wise decision. The repercussions were immediate and severe. By noon, local news vans had congregated along the street, with reporters thrusting microphones into the faces of residents. The footage Jake had captured, showing Greg rigging the spike strips and reviewing a list of approved vehicles, was already trending online. "This is outrageous," one resident shouted fiercely on camera. "I forked over thousands in HOA fees, and this is what they use it for? Installing traps." A woman nearby shook her head in disbelief. "I was fined last year for non-compliant flower pots, and now it turns out they're damaging cars behind our backs? I want my money back." Jake stood by, arms crossed, with his deputies ensuring that chaos didn't escalate. Nancy Wilkins, who once held the HOA presidency with an iron fist, tried to maintain her composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. We were only trying to keep the community safe," she stammered as a reporter held a mic in her direction. Jake stepped forward. "You weren't keeping anyone safe," he replied bluntly. "You were extorting residents." Nancy's face drained of color as the reporter shifted their focus to him. "Sheriff Carter, what happens now?" the reporter asked. "Well," Jake stated, "Greg is already facing felony charges, and since this was a coordinated effort, it's likely the entire HOA board will be investigated for fraud and mismanagement." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Nancy let out a nervous laugh. "You can't do that." Jake shot her a smirk. "I can, and I will." The HOA meeting that evening felt like a battlefield. Enraged homeowners jammed the clubhouse, voices rising in a cacophony. Residents clamored for answers. "You blew our budget on illegal spike strips," one man shouted. "What else have you hidden from us?" another woman snapped. Sweat glistening on her brow, Nancy tried to restore order. "Please, everyone, just calm down." "Shut it, Nancy!" an elderly man yelled from the back. The vote was unanimous. The HOA board was dissolved right there. Just like that, the empire Nancy had built crumbled before everyone's eyes. With the board disbanded, residents jumped into action to dismantle the wreckage that Nancy and her allies had left behind. First on the agenda, removing those spike strips. A handful of locals, armed with bolt cutters and crowbars, had them yanked out in no time. Cheers erupted as the last of the metal strips hit the dumpster. Next came the financial fallout. The county seized the HOA's remaining funds, redirecting them to reimburse homeowners for the damage to their vehicles and for unjust fines. Nancy and Greg weren't just stripped of their power, they were now facing personal liability. Greg, who once walked the neighborhood like a king, was now without a job, disgraced, and facing potential charges. To make matters worse, security. Footage caught him sneaking into the HOA treasury room just days before everything unraveled. An audit uncovered thousands of dollars unaccounted for. In a desperate attempt to save herself, Nancy turned on Greg, insisting he acted alone. Law enforcement wasn't buying it. Fraud, misuse of funds. Property tampering was just the beginning. The list of accusations kept piling up, and before long, the former HOA members who had backed Nancy began to disappear, likely trying to steer clear of any legal trouble. But here's the kicker. A few weeks later, Greg was seen at a flea market, frantically trying to sell off some old HOA-branded parking permits. Spoiler alert, not a single one found a buyer. The once mighty HOA, totally defunct. And you know what? Nobody missed it. With the HOA out of the picture, the neighborhood finally returned to a sense of normalcy. No more unexpected fines. No more absurd rules. No more self-important enforcers lurking around like they were on some power trip. To mark the occasion, the residents organized a huge barbecue, the first genuine community gathering that didn't feel like a forced HOA event. Jake relaxed in a lawn chair, enjoying a cold beverage as the aroma of grilled burgers wafted through the air. For once, there were no complaints. Tom nudged him with enthusiasm. We were talking, and we thought, how about renaming the road? Jake raised an eyebrow. Oh, really? Tom grinned. Yeah, something that fits, like Carter's Way. Jake laughed. I don't need my name on a road. Okay, Tom said, still smiling. How about a sign right at the entrance? Jake sighed, guessing where this was going. Let me guess. Sheriff's territory? Tom snapped his fingers. Exactly! The crowd went wild for the idea. Jake shook his head, chuckling. He didn't seek any recognition. He was just relieved that the right lessons had finally been learned. But if a simple sign could keep future HOAs from getting any bright ideas, he figured he wouldn't mind turning a blind eye.